The band was between songs when my mother-in-law tapped her champagne glass and told 40 of her closest friends that her son had married down. She said it with a smile, the kind that looks like a compliment if you're not the one it's aimed at. I set my fork down slowly next to a piece of anniversary cake I hadn't touched because I already knew something she didn't. I knew that the ballroom she'd rented the band she'd hired the 3-tier cake with her husband's company logo piped onto the top layer. All of it existed because of paper I had signed 2 years earlier. She had no idea that the woman she'd just humiliated in front of everyone she wanted to impress was the entire reason there was still a company left to celebrate 30 years of. If you like stories where the quiet person turns out to be the one holding everything together, stay with me, because this one has a moment I still replay. I was 34, married to a good man named Marcus for 9 years, and for most of those 9 years I'd been introduced at his family's parties as Marcus's wife. She does something with numbers. What I actually did was forensic accounting. Certified fraud examiner, 6 years at a boutique advisory firm that got called in when a company smelled something wrong in its own books and was too scared to ask its own employees about it. It wasn't glamorous work. I sat in windowless conference rooms with bankers' boxes and spreadsheets until numbers that didn't make sense started making sense, usually in a way that ruined someone's week. Patricia, my mother-in-law, never once asked what that meant exactly. She'd nod politely if I mentioned a case, then pivot to whatever her friend's daughter was doing, usually something with a title that sounded better over dessert. Patricia's whole life ran on how things sounded. Her husband Gerald had spent over 30 years building a mid-sized real estate development company, Ashford Grove Properties, and to Patricia, that company wasn't just income. It was proof. Proof that they belonged in rooms other people didn't get invited into. Marcus grew up inside that proof, but somehow came out of it warm and unpretentious, which was part of why I fell for him fast. Patricia hadn't come out the same way. When we got engaged, she hugged me at the dinner announcing it and told her sister just loud enough for me to hear over the clinking glasses. Well, he could have married a doctor, but I suppose accountants keep things organized. I let that one go. I let a lot of things go over the years because responding to Patricia felt like feeding something that only grew hungrier. At one Thanksgiving, she introduced me to a new neighbor as the one who does Marcus's taxes. I don't do taxes. It's not even the same field, but correcting her in front of a stranger felt like more effort than the moment deserved. At another birthday dinner, she asked in front of the whole table whether I'd ever thought about doing something bigger now that Marcus was doing so well at his own job. Marcus sold industrial equipment. He did fine. It was never really about either of our salaries. It was about which one of us sounded impressive at her events. There was one detail, though, that I noticed early and filed away without thinking much of it. At every family dinner, Gerald had a habit of talking a little too proudly about the numbers this quarter, in a tone that didn't quite match how development companies usually talk about numbers when things are actually fine. Confident people report good news. Gerald performed it. It meant nothing to anyone else at that table. To me, after 6 years of watching people perform confidence, they didn't have it registered as a small, specific kind of static. Marcus never fully understood why his mother's comments landed on me the way they did, and I never fully explained it to him because it wasn't really about the comments themselves. It was about the accumulation. One dismissive line at a holiday dinner is nothing. 50 of them spread across 9 years start to feel like a verdict you never got to argue against. I kept working, kept building a career I was quietly proud of, and kept showing up to family dinners as the woman who did something with numbers because Marcus was worth it, and because some part of me still believed that eventually something would make Patricia see it differently. I didn't know yet that the thing that would finally make her see it would also be the thing that saved her husband's company. The static started turning into something real about 2 years before that anniversary party, though nobody but me seemed to notice it happening. It began small. At a Sunday dinner, Gerald blamed a missed vendor payment on the new girl in accounts payable. You know how it is with young people these days. Patricia laughed and said, "At least Marcus's wife knows how to keep numbers straight. even if it's nothing like what Gerald manages. I remember it landing less like a compliment and more like a reminder of exactly how small she considered my version of numbers to be. A few weeks later, in the family group chat Patricia mostly used for photos of her garden, she wrote half joking, "Gerald says cash flow's tight this quarter. Must be all these young people who don't want to work hard like we did." Vanessa replied with a laughing emoji. Nobody else responded. I read it twice and put my phone face down on the counter. At a birthday dinner that spring, Patricia cornered me near the dessert table and asked, with the particular gentleness she reserved for questions that weren't gentle at all, "Do you and Marcus have enough saved up, in case things ever got tight?" "We're fine, Patricia," I told her. She patted my forearm. "Of course you are, dear." Then smiling the whole time, "It's just some people build something and some people just manage what's already built." That line stuck with me longer than she probably intended. I stood there long enough to notice the clock behind her said 8:42, deciding whether it was worth responding to. I decided it wasn't. A month after that, at a dinner celebrating Gerald's birthday, Patricia raised her glass and said to the whole table, laughing like it was the gentlest joke in the world, "To Gerald, who built an empire from nothing, and to Marcus, who at least found a wife who can count it for him." A few people laughed. Marcus didn't. I smiled anyway because I'd learned by then that flinching only ever fed her more material, and I filed that line away too in the same drawer as everything else. It was, I'd think later, exactly the kind of line that would have made a very good headline if anyone had ever written this story down. 2 weeks earlier, my firm had taken on a new client, a mid-sized real estate developer flagged by their bank for irregular reporting on a $4.7 million line of credit. Engagements got assigned by a partner, and I usually didn't know who I'd be working for until the file physically landed on my desk. When it landed 3 days after that birthday dinner, I sat very still in my office before I opened it. Ashford Grove Properties, Gerald's company. I could have recused myself. Most firms would have let me given the family connection, and part of me wanted to, because some instinct already told me I wasn't going to like what I found. But the partner running the engagement didn't know Gerald was my father-in-law. I'd never once used my married name at work, an old habit from years of keeping my two lives separate, and by the time I seriously considered saying something, I'd already seen enough of the preliminary numbers to know that speed mattered more than my own comfort. If I stepped back now, whoever replaced me would spend weeks catching up to where I already was, and weeks were exactly what this file didn't have. Over the following 11 weeks, working late enough that Marcus started asking what was going on, I found a controller, not Gerald, a longtime employee named Doug Renner, who had been quietly siphoning money through a shell vendor account for almost 4 years. Small enough each month to avoid attention. Large enough that it had eaten $34,000, and worse, had thrown off every financial statement Gerald had used to secure that $4.7 million line of credit. The bank's covenant required accurate reporting. If the discrepancies surfaced through the bank's own audit before the company caught it internally, Ashford Grove wouldn't just lose the credit line, it would be in technical default on the hook for immediate repayment it didn't have. 30 years of proof would collapse in about 6 weeks. Around the same time at a Sunday lunch, I almost skipped out of sheer exhaustion. Patricia mentioned apropos of nothing that a friend's daughter had just made partner at her law firm. "Isn't that wonderful?" she said, looking directly at me. "It's nice when people really push themselves." I said it was wonderful too, and ate my salad, and didn't mention that I'd spent the entire previous week inside a shell company trail that would end up saving her husband's business, because it wasn't mine to say yet, and because some quiet, stubborn part of me still wanted to see how far she'd go without knowing. Marcus noticed I'd gone quiet during that stretch. "You've been somewhere else for weeks," he said one night, not accusing, just tired. "Is it work?" "It's work," I told him. "I can't talk about it yet." He didn't push, which was one of the reasons I'd married him, though I could tell it cost him something not to ask twice. A few nights later, on a call with his sister, I overheard him mention lightly that I'd had a big case lately, real stressed out. Vanessa's response carried across the room. "Must be nice to have a job stressful enough to complain about. Must mean it matters to somebody." Marcus didn't answer her. He just looked at me across the kitchen and mouthed, "Sorry." I sat on Patricia and Gerald's patio 2 weekends into that engagement, listening to Gerald tell his golf friend how solid everything was at Ashford Grove this year, and said nothing because legally I couldn't yet. My findings weren't finalized. And even once they were, client confidentiality doesn't bend for family holidays. Patricia at the same table told the golf friend's wife that she sometimes worried Marcus and I were a little behind where we should be by now, at our age. Vanessa laughed and added, "Honestly, some people just aren't built for ambition, and that's okay too." I remember thinking very clearly that the woman sitting 3 feet from her saying absolutely nothing was 11 days from finishing the report that would decide whether her husband's entire identity survived the summer. If you'd been sitting at that patio table knowing what I knew, and saying absolutely nothing I want to know in the comments, would you have told them right then? Or would you have let the report finish speaking for itself first? By week 9, I had enough to be certain, but not enough to be finished. And those two things matter differently in my line of work. Certainty tells you what happened. Finished means you can prove it in a way that survives a bank's own auditors picking it apart line by line. I spent 4 more days tracing the shell vendor's payments back through 3 different accounts before I found the pattern that made it undeniable, the same 4-digit routing suffix reused out of what I'd guess was simple laziness appearing in transfers going back nearly 4 years. I remember staring at that number on my screen at 11 at night in an office 3 floors above an empty parking garage, thinking about how Patricia had asked me only weeks earlier whether I'd ever considered doing something more substantial with myself. I finished the report on a Tuesday. It went to my managing partner, then to Ashford Grove's board and legal counsel, then to the bank. Doug Renner was terminated within the week, and the company pursued restitution against him. The bank, seeing a company that had caught and corrected the problem itself, before an external audit forced the issue, restructured the covenant instead of calling in the loan. Gerald kept his company. He never fully understood how close he'd come to losing it, because the version of the story he told afterward at every dinner for the next year was that our accountant found some paperwork issue and we fixed it quickly. He said our accountant the way he said everything that had gone right for him, like it was simply one more thing the universe owed him. He never once asked which accountant. I didn't tell him. Not out of spite, but out of the same instinct that had kept my 2 lives separate for years. It felt like a door I didn't need to open. Marcus knew because I told him everything eventually, once the engagement closed, and I was free to talk about it. He went quiet for a long moment, sitting across from me at our kitchen table, then asked why I hadn't said anything at that patio dinner. I didn't need credit for doing my job, I told him. "Maybe you did," he said quietly. "Maybe you've been not needing credit for 9 years and it's cost you more than either of us noticed. My mother's been calling you small for a decade, and this whole time you were the reason my dad still has a company to be proud of." I didn't have an answer for that, so I just reached across the table and held his hand for a while. 3 weeks before the anniversary party, Vanessa called me warmer than she'd been in years, asking if she could stop by just to catch up. It's been forever. I said yes, glad at first that something might be shifting between us. She stayed almost 2 hours, admired our kitchen renovation. A little too closely, asked what the contractor had charged, asked whether Marcus had gotten that promotion he'd mentioned at Easter, and then almost carelessly in the middle of a sentence about something else entirely asked whether we'd been able to put anything away for a house upgrade given everything going on with rates right now. I answered honestly, because I had nothing to hide. It was only after she left that I noticed she'd photographed our new backsplash for inspiration, and that 2 days later, Patricia mentioned to a mutual friend, apparently completely unprompted, that she'd heard money's a bit tight for Marcus and his wife lately. I hadn't said that to anyone. Nobody had said that except Vanessa, quietly reporting back exactly what she'd been sent to find. "You two seem really settled," Vanessa had said near the end of that visit, looking around our kitchen one more time. "It's nice. Not everyone gets settled this fast." I remember thinking, even in the moment, that settled was doing a lot of work in that sentence, a softer way of saying smaller. The same way manages what's already built had been a softer way of saying less. I didn't confront her. I filed it away the same place I'd filed Gerald's too proud quarterly updates 2 years earlier. Some information is only useful once you understand exactly what to do with it, and by then I was starting to understand exactly what I was going to do with all of it. I thought for a few days about telling Gerald directly privately before the party, sitting him down and simply saying it was me. Here's what happened, you should know. I even drafted the conversation in my head a dozen different ways, but every version of it felt like it was still asking for something. Acknowledgement, gratitude, a shift in how the family saw me delivered on my terms instead of earned on its own. I decided in the end that if it was going to change anything, it needed to come out because the moment demanded it not, because I'd engineered a quiet sit-down to make sure I got credit. I didn't know yet that the moment would demand it at full volume in front of 40 guests over cake. The 30th anniversary party was Patricia's event, in every sense of the word, her guest list. Her florist, her seating chart engineered so the important families sat closest to the head table. 40 guests. A string quartet that turned into a full band after dinner. A ballroom Gerald had rented at a rate that I happened to know from the company's own books had required board sign-off 2 months earlier. I sat through the toasts. I sat through Patricia's speech about building something real together brick by brick. I sat through dinner, where she asked the woman seated next to me in a voice pitched deliberately to carry whether accounting was still keeping me busy, or if I'd ever thought about doing something more substantial with myself. Vanessa sat 2 seats down, quiet, in a way that felt now less like modesty and more like waiting. I wondered watching her how many more small errands, like the backsplash photos she'd run over the years, without either of us naming it out loud. Then between songs, glass raised, smiling the entire time Patricia said it to the whole table and everyone near it, that Marcus had married down. That she loved me, of course, but a mother could be honest at her own anniversary. Some people build something, and some people just get to enjoy it. I set my fork down. Patricia, I said, keeping my voice as pleasant as hers had been, can I ask you something? Do you know what actually happened to Ashford Grove's credit line about 2 years ago? She blinked, caught off guard by how specific the question was. There was some paperwork issue. Gerald handled it. Gerald didn't handle it, I said. I did. I'm the forensic accountant who found the $34,000 Doug Renner had been taking for almost 4 years, and the report I wrote is the reason the bank didn't call in $4.7 million and shut this company down about 6 weeks before you'd have had to cancel this exact party. The table went quiet in that specific way. A room goes quiet when it senses it's about to become a story people tell later. Patricia's smile stayed on her face a beat too long, the way a picture stays on a wall after the nail's already given way. That's not true, she said. Gerald said it was one of the firms he works with. He never mentioned it was. He never asked my last name at the firm, I said. I never volunteered it. I didn't need you to know. I needed the company to survive because my husband loves his father and I love my husband. That's the only reason I did any of it quietly. I don't believe that Patricia said quieter now, but still sharp. You'd remember something like that. You'd have said something. I have the engagement letter in my email right now, I said. Dated 14 months ago. My signature's on the final report the bank accepted. I can show you at this table if you'd like. This is absurd, Patricia said, glancing around at the guests now watching openly. We are not doing this here. Tonight is about 30 years of marriage, not spreadsheets. You brought up how we measure a marriage first, I said. I'm just adding the part you left out. Gerald, 3 seats down, had gone very pale. Is that true? He asked. Not to me, to Patricia, as if she might somehow contradict it. I'm sure it was a team effort, Patricia said, straightening her voice, climbing back into its dinner party register. Gerald has excellent people around him. That doesn't change anything about... It changes the math, I said, still gently, still not raising my voice. You've spent 2 years telling people I do something small with numbers. Your husband's company exists right now tonight because of exactly that small thing. So here's your list of who matters at this table. I nodded toward the seating chart she'd spent weeks arranging, and here's my signature on the document that kept the lights on in this room. I just think it's worth putting those two things side by side once out loud, since you brought it up first. For just a moment, and I want to be fair to her because I watched it happen, something in Patricia's face genuinely cracked. Not embarrassment, fear. The real kind. The kind that flickers across someone's face when they understand all at once exactly how close they came to losing everything they've spent 30 years building their identity around, and how little of the saving was theirs to claim. Her hand found the edge of the tablecloth and gripped it. For about 2 seconds, she looked like a woman instead of a performance. Then it closed back over. Well, she said, chin lifting again, I still don't see why any of that means Marcus married down. Money isn't the only measure of a person. No, I said. It isn't. You brought it up first, though. Twice tonight. It doesn't matter. She said one more time, quieter, but still reaching for the last word. This is still our night. It's exactly the point, Patricia Gerald said suddenly, quietly still pale looking at his wife, like he was seeing her for the first time in years. That's exactly the point. Nobody at the table said anything else for a long moment. Somewhere behind us, the band started a new song, oblivious. Patricia never apologized that night or the week after, or really at all, in the way I used to imagine she might back when I still hoped a moment like that would fix something between us. What changed was quieter than an apology. She stopped introducing me as the one who does something with numbers. She started occasionally asking real questions about my work, and actually wading through the answer. Gerald calls me sometimes now, just to check in a way he never used to. Vanessa and I have never once spoken about the backsplash photos, and I don't think we ever will, and I've made my peace with that particular door staying shut. What I learned that night wasn't some tidy lesson about karma finally catching up with someone. It was something quieter than that staying quiet for 2 years wasn't weakness. It was just timing, and that proof doesn't need volume to land. It just needs to be true, and eventually it gets said in front of exactly the people who needed to hear it. I still don't think Patricia fully understands even now why that moment changed things between us the way it did. I don't think she ever will, and I've stopped needing her to. Marcus tells me sometimes that he watches his mother differently now, not with anger, just with a kind of clear-eyed distance. She probably doesn't notice the same distance I'd been carrying toward her for years, without either of them realizing it. Some things don't get repaired so much as quietly renegotiated, and I've come to think that's its own kind of ending, even if it isn't the neat one. If you've ever sat in a room while someone underestimated you, all the while quietly holding the whole thing together, tell me in the comments what finally made you set your own fork down. If this one hit home, share it with someone who needs to hear. That quiet doesn't mean small, and subscribe, because there are a lot more of these stories where the person everyone counted out turns out to be the one holding it all up.